Razia Sultana, the defiant queen who challenged tradition. On a sweltering morning in 1236, the people of Delhi witnessed an extraordinary sight. A woman, unveiled and astride a war elephant, rode through the streets of the ancient city. She wore not the traditional garments of a noblewoman, but the tunic and trousers of a Turkish warrior. The crowds that gathered that day beheld something unprecedented in the Islamic world: a female sultan, born to a slave, who would dare to rule one of medieval history's most powerful empires. Her name was Razia, and she would shatter every convention of her time. This is not merely the tale of a woman who ruled in a man's world. It is the story of a political prodigy who outmaneuvered seasoned generals, a military commander who led armies from the front lines, and a visionary ruler who dared to imagine an empire where merit mattered more than birth or gender. But in challenging the foundations of power in medieval India, Razia Sultana would discover that breaking the chains of tradition came at a terrible price. Her rise from slave's daughter to sultan would spark a deadly game of power, passion, and betrayal that would end in one of history's most dramatic last stands and change the course of an empire forever. Razia, the slave's daughter who dared to dream of power. The slave markets of Central Asia thrummed with commerce on the day Razia's father was sold. Merchants from Delhi had journeyed far across the Hindu Kush mountains seeking the prized Turkish slaves. Young men and women renowned throughout the Islamic world for their beauty, intelligence, and martial prowess. Among the countless souls traded that day was a boy who would one day become Sultan Iltutmish, and whose daughter would shake the foundations of an empire. The peculiar genius of the Delhi Sultanate lay in its transformation of slaves into sovereigns. While Europe's medieval kingdoms suffocated under the weight of hereditary nobility, Delhi's Turkish slave kings built a meritocracy forged in blood and ambition. In this world, a slave could rise to general, governor, or even sultan if they had the cunning and courage to seize their destiny. Into this crucible of power was born a girl child in 1205, daughter of the slave-turned-sultan Iltutmish and his concubine Shah Turkhan. Young Razia's earliest memories were of sword steel and battle drums. While other noble daughters learned poetry and needlework behind latticed windows, she sat at her father's feet in the durbar, absorbing the intricate dance of politics and power. The Sultan's advisors were scandalized when Iltutmish began taking his daughter on military campaigns, but the aging ruler saw something in Razia that his sons lacked: the fire of ambition tempered by the wisdom to rule. By the age of 12, Razia was already joining her father's war councils, her quick mind grasping strategies that eluded seasoned commanders. In an age when most noble women lived behind veils, she learned to ride, hunt, and wield a sword. The palace whispered that the Sultan was grooming his daughter not as a princess, but as an heir. They did not yet understand that Iltutmish had recognized a fundamental truth. In a kingdom built by slaves turned kings, true nobility flowed not through blood, but through the strength to seize one's destiny. The defining moment came during the siege of Gwalior in 1218. 13-year-old Razia, against all convention, accompanied her father's army. When the supply lines were threatened by marauding bandits, she personally led a cavalry charge to protect the caravan, earning the respect of hardened warriors twice her age. That night, before his assembled generals, Iltutmish did the unthinkable. He publicly praised his daughter's judgment above that of his sons. The seeds of future conflict were sown in that moment, though none present could foresee the storms that would engulf Delhi's throne. As Razia grew into womanhood, she cultivated a network of allies among the lower nobles and military commanders, many of them former slaves like her father. She understood instinctively that true power in Delhi lay not with the old Arab aristocracy, but with these hungry, ambitious men who had risen from nothing. They saw in her their own reflection, a person judged not by birth, but by the fire in their soul. What they did not yet realize was that this young woman would soon challenge not just the old nobility, but the very foundations of their world. For in the shadows of the harem, behind the delicate screens that separated women's quarters from the halls of power, a revolution was brewing. And at its heart was a slave's daughter who dared to dream of something unprecedented in the Islamic world, a woman who would rule not as queen or empress, but as sultan. Razia, the rise of a sovereign in 13th century Delhi. The Delhi court of 1230 was a glittering snake pit of ambition. Behind the jeweled facades and honeyed words, a silent war raged between the old Arab nobility and the rising class of slave soldiers. Into this arena stepped Razia, now 25, her father's most trusted advisor despite her gender. She moved through the court like a master player, trading in the only currency that mattered in Delhi information. Each morning before dawn, she would meet with her father in the private audience chamber, bringing reports from her growing network of spies. While her brothers drowned themselves in wine and courtesans, Razia was mapping the loyalties of every noble family, every military commander, every provincial governor. Iltutmish watched his daughter's political awakening with a mixture of pride and concern. She had inherited his tactical mind, but possessed something he never had, the ability to inspire fierce personal loyalty in both allies and servants. When famine struck the western provinces in 1231, Razia seized her chance to prove herself. Against the advice of conservative nobles, she convinced her father to open the royal granaries to the people. But she went further, personally overseeing the distribution, eating with peasants, listening to their grievances. The common people began calling her the people's princess, but Razia was playing a deeper game. She understood that in times of crisis, the love of the masses was worth more than gold. The turning point came during the Rajput Rebellion of 1232. While her brothers argued for brutal repression, Razia proposed a radical solution: diplomatic engagement backed by military strength. She personally negotiated with the rebel leaders, speaking their language, respecting their customs, while simultaneously positioning troops to cut off their retreat. The rebellion ended not in bloodshed, but in a lasting peace that would secure Delhi's western borders for decades. Iltutmish's decision to name Razia his heir was not announced in some grand durbar, but in a quiet moment after a council meeting. The burden of kingship, he told his stunned advisors, requires a mind that sees beyond the horizon of custom. The words fell like thunderbolts in the silent chamber. By choosing the title Sultan rather than Sultana for his daughter, Iltutmish was declaring that Razia would rule not as a woman, but as a sovereign in her own right. The backlash was immediate and vicious. Conservative ulema declared it an affront to Islamic law. Noble families who had hoped to control Razia's dissolute brothers withdrew their support. Even some of her own allies counseled her to reject the succession in favor of a less controversial choice. But they had fundamentally misunderstood both father and daughter. In a realm built by former slaves, conventional wisdom held no power over those with the courage to defy it. In the final years of his reign, Iltutmish accelerated his daughter's preparation for power. She began presiding over public courts, leading military reviews, issuing decrees in her own name. The old Sultan was racing against time, knowing that his death would unleash forces that would test his daughter to her limits. What no one could predict was that the greatest threat to Razia's rule would come not from her enemies, but from those closest to her heart. The rise of Razia Sultan, a struggle for power and tradition. The death of Sultan Iltutmish in April 1236 unleashed a storm that had been brewing for decades. Before his body was cold, Shah Turkan, the slave-born mother of both Razia and Ruknuddin, set her gambit in motion. In a masterwork of political theatre, she emerged from the harem wailing and tearing at her clothes, only to transform mid-grief into a steely regent, declaring her son Ruknuddin as the rightful heir. The crowd of nobles, still reeling from the loss of their sultan, found themselves swept along by her performance. Ruknuddin's coronation was a carnival of excess that masked a calculated purge. While her son drowned himself in pleasure, Shah Turkan moved through the shadows with quiet efficiency, eliminating potential threats. Old allies of Iltutmish vanished into dungeons. Military commanders loyal to Razia were reassigned to distant posts. The treasury was emptied for bribes and spectacles, each coin buying another day of precarious power. But Shah Turkan had miscalculated the temper of Delhi's streets. The common people who had come to love Razia during the famine years watched in growing anger as their city descended into chaos. Markets closed as merchants hoarded goods. Crime flourished as police posts stood empty. In the mosques, imams began speaking of divine displeasure at a kingdom that had rejected its rightful heir. On the 40th day of Ruknuddin's reign, the powder keg ignited. It began in the spice market, when a merchant refused to accept the debased coins now flooding from the royal mint. By nightfall, the riots had spread to every quarter of Delhi. Shah Turkan, sensing the shift in winds, made her final mistake. She ordered troops to fire on the crowds. The arrows fell, but the soldiers then did something unprecedented. They turned their bows toward the palace. Razia chose this moment to emerge from her forced seclusion. She appeared not at the palace gates, but in the city's main mosque, dressed in the red robes of her father's house. The sight of her, unbowed, unbroken, sparked something in the crowd. Here was no pampered princess seeking a throne, but a leader forged in the crucible of Delhi's own traditions. When she spoke, it was not of her rights or her grievances, but of the people suffering under a corrupt regime. The end came with shocking swiftness. As crowds stormed the palace, Shah Turkan's carefully bought allies melted away. Ruknuddin, found hiding in his harem, traded his crown for his life and accepted exile. His mother, defiant to the last, had to be dragged from the throne room. But it was her final words to her daughter that would echo through history. "You think you've won." A woman who seeks to rule as a man will lose everything that makes her powerful as a woman. As Razia ascended the throne that evening, the cheers of the crowd nearly drowned out the muezzin's call to prayer. Delhi had its first female sultan, not through inheritance or intrigue, but through the will of its people. Yet even in triumph, Razia knew that her real battle was just beginning. For in choosing to rule as sultan rather than queen, she had set herself against centuries of tradition. The price of that choice would be paid in full measure before her story reached its end. Razia Sultan, a revolutionary ruler who defied tradition. Dawn broke over Delhi to the sound of trumpets and the stamp of war elephants. The crowds gathering for Razia's first public durbar witnessed a transformation that would scandalize the Islamic world. Their new ruler emerged not in the veiled, bejeweled splendor of a queen, but in the stark military tunic and turban of a Turkish warrior king. The silence that fell over the court was absolute. Then a voice called out from the crowd, "Long live the Sultan, not Sultana!" Sultan. Within hours, Razia began dismantling centuries of protocol. She ordered the removal of the screens that had traditionally separated male and female sections of the court. When her advisors protested that no man would accept direct commands from a woman, she demonstrated her solution by personally drilling the palace guard in sword combat. Those who couldn't overcome their prejudices were quickly replaced by more adaptable minds, many drawn from the ranks of former slaves who owed their positions to merit rather than birth. The army posed a unique challenge. Medieval Islamic soldiers were bound by strict codes regarding women in authority, yet warfare was the foundation of the Sultanate's power. Razia's solution was characteristically bold. She led her troops on a series of lightning raids against bandits who had been terrorizing trade routes. In battle, she proved herself a tactical innovator, using light cavalry in ways that caught her enemies and her own generals by surprise. Soldiers who had bristled at following a woman began boasting of serving under the sword arm of Delhi. But it was in matters of state that Razia truly revolutionized the Sultanate. She established a new court of appeals where common people could seek justice without paying bribes to intermediaries. She appointed administrators based on ability rather than ancestry, infuriating the old nobility, but dramatically improving the efficiency of tax collection and public works. When drought threatened the northern provinces, she personally led the relief efforts, sleeping in camps alongside her officials. The religious establishment posed a more subtle threat. While Islamic law didn't explicitly forbid female rulers, centuries of tradition weighed against it. Razia countered by becoming a patron of scholars and poets, turning Delhi into a center of learning that attracted intellectuals from across Asia. She studied Islamic jurisprudence herself, often engaging religious scholars in public debates that demonstrated her deep knowledge of the law. Those who sought to challenge her authority on religious grounds found themselves outmaneuvered by her mastery of their own texts. Yet even as she consolidated power, Razia was acutely aware of the isolation of her position. Her closest advisors were men who could never be true friends. The women of the court were kept at a distance by her rejection of traditional female roles. In private moments, her only confidant was her childhood nurse, who alone remembered the girl she had been before becoming Sultan. It was to this old woman that Razia confided her growing attraction to one of her most talented commanders, an attraction that would ultimately shake the foundations of her reign. The breaking point came during a state ceremony marking her first year as Sultan. As she sat upon the elephant of state, resplendent in military regalia, a lone assassin broke through her guards. The crowd gasped as Razia, rather than retreating, drew her sword and parried the attack herself. The would-be killer was captured and under interrogation revealed a plot involving some of Delhi's most prominent nobles. Their execution the next day sent a clear message. The Sultan would not be cowed by those who refused to accept the new order she was creating. But that night, alone in her chambers, Razia faced the truth that would define the rest of her reign. To rule as she wished, she would have to sacrifice any hope of living as other women did. The choice she made and its consequences would echo through history as both a triumph and a tragedy. The bold reforms and tragic legacy of Razia Sultan. Spring of 1237 brought winds of change to Delhi. While other rulers contented themselves with grand monuments, Razia launched reforms that cut to the heart of how power flowed through her empire. Her first target was the entrenched bureaucracy that had grown fat on bribes and corruption. When she discovered officials selling grain meant for famine relief, she had them publicly flogged, noble and commoner alike. The message was clear. Under her rule, rank would no longer shield wrongdoing. Her most radical innovation was the establishment of schools that admitted students regardless of birth or gender. In these madrasas, the children of merchants studied alongside those of nobles, while girls were taught subjects previously reserved for boys. Conservative clerics were outraged, but Razia countered by establishing a new class of state scholars who preached a more inclusive interpretation of Islamic law. The debate between tradition and reform that had simmered for generations now burst into the open. The appointment of Jamal-ud-Din Yaqut as her personal secretary sent shockwaves through the court. An Abyssinian slave of exceptional intelligence, Yaqut represented everything the old guard feared, a dark-skinned foreigner rising above his station through merit alone. Worse, in their eyes, was the obvious chemistry between him and the Sultan. Their private meetings, though focused on matters of state, sparked whispers that would soon grow into roars. Military innovation proved equally controversial. Razia broke with centuries of tradition by recruiting Hindu soldiers into her army's elite units, arguing that skill with a sword mattered more than religious affiliation. She established a new corps of mounted archers drawn from the steppes, their lightning tactics proving devastating against the slow-moving armies of rival kingdoms. Yet each victory only intensified the grumbling among her conservative generals, who saw their monopoly on military power eroding. The noble families struck back through their most potent weapon, marriage alliances. A succession of powerful lords presented their sons as potential consorts, each offering to help the Sultan rule in a more traditional manner. Razia's consistent refusal to marry was presented by her enemies as proof that she was unnatural, perhaps even enchanted by dark magic. When she promoted Yaqut to the position of Emir-e-Kil, master of the royal stables, the whispers turned to open accusations of impropriety. Crisis erupted in the province of Bathinda, where the governor Malik al-Tunia raised the banner of rebellion. His proclamation was carefully worded. He claimed loyalty to the Sultanate, while declaring Razia unfit to rule due to her abandonment of proper conduct. Other governors watched carefully, waiting to see how the Sultan would respond to this first direct challenge to her authority. Razia's response was characteristic in its boldness. Rather than sending an army, she rode to Bathinda with only a small guard, intending to confront Al-Tunia personally. It was a gamble that had worked before. Her presence had quelled previous disturbances through sheer force of personality. But this time, she had fatally misread the situation. The trap was already set, baited with her own desire to prove herself worthy of the throne. As she approached Bathinda's gates, the true architects of the rebellion revealed themselves. Noble houses that had seemed loyal now showed their true colors, their armies converging on the province like vultures circling wounded prey. In that moment, Razia faced a choice that would define not just her reign, but her very understanding of herself. The decision she made would transform a political crisis into a story of passion, betrayal, and tragedy that would be remembered for centuries to come. Love, Power and Betrayal, the Saga of Razia, Sultan and Yakut. History remembers great affairs of state, but empires often turn on matters of the heart. In the sweltering summer of 1238, Jamal ud-Din Yakut became more than just Razia's trusted advisor. Their stolen glances across the Durbar Hall, their long private conferences in the palace gardens, these small intimacies set poison tongues wagging. But what truly terrified Delhi's power brokers was not the possibility of scandal, but the reality that Yakut's brilliant administrative reforms were making their traditional powers obsolete. The conspiracy that followed was a masterwork of political manipulation. Anonymous letters circulated in the bazaars, spinning lurid tales of midnight trysts and foreign sorcery. Merchants who owed their licenses to Yakut's fair-minded administration suddenly found their caravans attacked by bandits. Religious scholars who had supported Razia's reforms faced mysterious accusations of heresy. The web of intrigue drew tighter with each passing day. Malik Altunia played his part with consummate skill. His letters to Razia were masterpieces of concerned loyalty, warning of unrest while positioning himself as her most steadfast defender. When he finally invited her to Bathinda to discuss the situation, even Yakut counseled acceptance. The trap was so perfectly laid that its victims walked into it willingly, believing themselves in control until the very moment the gates slammed shut. The betrayal, when it came, was swift and brutal. Yakut was dragged from his horse before Razia's eyes, his brilliant mind spilled onto the dusty road by a common soldier's blade. The Sultan herself was imprisoned in Bathinda's highest tower, her loyal guard cut down or scattered. Altunia, revealing himself as the rebellion's mastermind, expected her to break. Instead, he encountered something he had never seen before, a woman who had transcended conventional notions of power. What happened next has puzzled historians for centuries. Whether through political calculation or genuine emotion, Razia and Altunia's relationship transformed during her captivity. Their conversations through the iron grate of her cell evolved from terse negotiations to passionate debates about the future of the Sultanate. In Altunia, Razia found something she had never expected, a man who could see past her title to the visionary leader beneath. Their marriage, announced 3 months into her imprisonment, shocked both allies and enemies. Some saw it as a brilliant political maneuver, others as proof of Razia's compromised judgment. The truth was more complex. Two ambitious souls had recognized in each other a shared dream of what the Sultanate could become. But dreams, as Delhi's power brokers knew well, were dangerous things. The alliance that emerged from Bathinda bore little resemblance to what the conspirators had planned. Rather than a chastened puppet ruler, they faced a reinvigorated Razia supported by Altunia's military prowess. Their combined forces began a lightning campaign to retake Delhi, their army swelling with commoners and low-ranking nobles who saw in their union a chance for real change. But the old guard had one final card to play. As Razia and Altunia marched on the capital, whispers spread through their camp of secret messages, midnight meetings, hidden loyalties. The seeds of doubt, once planted, grew like weeds in the garden of trust. Love, even one as powerful as theirs, proved fragile against the weight of centuries of tradition and the relentless machinery of power. The legend of Sultan Razia, a tale of courage and betrayal. October 1240 dawned blood-red over the plains outside Delhi. Razia's army, a patchwork force of loyal veterans and recent converts to her cause, faced the massive host assembled by the noble confederacy. The capital's minarets gleamed in the distance, a tantalizing prize that had drawn armies to their doom for centuries. But this battle would be different. For the first time in Islamic history, a woman general would fight for a throne she had already proven herself worthy to hold. The night before had brought omens. A meteor shower lit up the sky, which the army's Hindu soldiers saw as divine arrows heralding great change. In her tent, Razia made a final bid to prevent the bloodshed, sending an emissary to the rebel leaders with an offer of amnesty. Their response came at dawn, the emissary's head catapulted over the battle lines. War it would be then, and no quarter given. Altunia's loyalty wavered at the crucial moment. Whether moved by secret bribes, old allegiances, or simple fear, he held his cavalry in reserve as Razia's center came under devastating attack. The betrayal might have shattered another leader, but Razia had been forged in harder fires. She rallied her personal guard, the same warriors who had followed her since her first days as Sultan, and led a desperate charge into the enemy's heart. What followed became legend. Witnesses spoke of her red banner flying above the chaos, of her sword flashing like lightning as she cut her way toward the rebel command. Some swore they heard her laughing as arrows darkened the sky, defiant to the last. Her final words, recorded by a dying scribe, were not a lament but a battle cry. Let them see how a sultan dies. The end came not with a clang of swords, but with treachery's quiet knife. As Razia pressed her attack, assassins who had infiltrated her personal guard struck from behind. She fell not by a warrior's blade, but by poisoned daggers in the dark. Her last sight was of Altunia's cavalry finally moving, not to save her, but to join the enemy. Even then she did not cry out. Delhi's crowds, who had once cheered her ascension, watched in silence as the victors paraded her body through the streets. But something unexpected happened. Women wept openly, breaking purdah to show their grief. Common soldiers laid their weapons at her feet. What began as a victory parade transformed into a funeral procession as the city showed its true heart. The noble families who had schemed for her downfall found their triumph hollow. They had killed a woman, but created a legend. In the bazaars, poets already sang of the slave girl who became sultan, who dared to dream of an empire where merit mattered more than birth or gender. Each generation that followed would find in her story something new: inspiration, warning, tragedy, triumph. Razia's grave, unmarked at first, became a secret shrine where women came to pray for strength. Centuries later, when India struggled for independence, her name would be invoked by those fighting for women's rights. Her reign lasted only 4 years, but its echoes would resound through history, proof that power lies not in titles or traditions, but in the courage to defy them. The morning after her death, Delhi's people awoke to find mysterious markings carved into the walls of the royal mosque. In flowing Arabic script was written, "Here ruled a sultan who was also a woman, and in her brief reign, justice outweighed custom. The author was never found." Perhaps it doesn't matter. The words remain carved in stone, outlasting empires. Razia Sultana, a legacy of revolutionary leadership. In the ruins of Old Delhi, tourists still trace their fingers over mysterious carvings that some say date to Razia's time. Local guides tell tales of secret passages where the female sultan planned her reforms, of hidden chambers where she trained with sword and bow. Most are inventions, But the persistence of these stories speaks to something deeper: humanity's need for heroes who shatter the prisons of prejudice. The true legacy of Razia's reign lies not in monuments but in moments of transformation. When Indira Gandhi became India's first female prime minister, she specifically cited Razia's example of leading from the battlefield rather than the balcony. In Pakistan's tribal regions, young women memorize her speeches as proof that Islamic leadership has never been solely the province of men. Each generation finds in her story the revolution it needs most. Modern historians have uncovered fascinating details about the changes her brief reign initiated. Agricultural records show that her reform of the land revenue system increased food production by allowing women to inherit farmland. Coins from her era reveal the first standardization of Delhi's currency, bearing the unprecedented inscription, "Pillar of Women," alongside Sultan of the Age. Archaeological discoveries suggest her schools continued operating in secret for decades after her death, preserving her dream of education for all. Yet perhaps Razia's most profound impact was on the nature of power itself. She proved that authority flows not from tradition, but from the ability to imagine a better world and the courage to fight for it. She demonstrated that true leadership transcends gender, that merit matters more than birth, that justice is stronger than custom. These ideas, revolutionary in her time, remain radical in many parts of the world today. In the end, Razia's story is not just about the past, it's about possibility. Each time a girl is told she cannot lead, each time tradition is used to justify inequality, her ghost stalks the corridors of power. She reminds us that the most dangerous person in any age is the one who dares to question why things must remain as they have always been. The last written record of Razia's influence comes from an unexpected source. In 1950, when India's Constitutional Assembly debated women's rights, a weathered manuscript was discovered in the archives of an old Delhi madrasa. It contained a single line, attributed to an anonymous scholar writing a century after her death. They killed her because she showed us that the impossible was possible. But once seen, such things cannot be unseen. The door she opened can never truly be closed.